Hi everyone, it's Dr. Domingo. Wanted to welcome you to our session on the overview of the purpose statement and research questions. Wanted to welcome every one of you that's joining us online. So here we go. So what are we going to do in this session? First thing is we're going to examine the connection between the problems and the purposes. We'll talk about how they're linked. Second is we're going to organize some research methodology ideas, or essentially we're going to talk about the research question, not necessarily methodology, but about the research question itself and how to craft that and create that. And finally, we'll evaluate the alignment among problem, purpose, and research questions. If there's good alignment, there'll be a good dissertation. Keep on stressing that word, alignment, alignment, alignment. That will become evident as we go through this session. So, I have this saying, good questions are better than bad answers. The key in this phase of the dissertation is to talk about and discuss, and really for you to formulate what the right question is. And the key to having a good question or a good research question is having a good purpose statement. A key to having a good purpose statement, you'll see, is having a good problem statement. So let's review the difference between basic and applied research. Basic research is generating new knowledge to advance your field. You're finding out stuff to find out more stuff about stuff. Okay? While applied knowledge is generating and applying new knowledge in pursuit of a solution to a problem in the field. So, some discussions have talked about the difference between a PhD and an EDD, and simply put, with basic and applied research, one is creating knowledge for knowledge's sake, and the other is utilizing knowledge to solve a problem. It's the application of knowledge that we're interested in. And so, therefore, all our dissertations here at CityU are applied dissertations. I always begin a dissertation process in working with my students. I introduce them to this thing called the research topic triangle. Now, you may be still just thinking about your topic, and that's fine too, but as you start narrowing the universe of ideas that are out there, what you want to study in your dissertation, this handy little upside-down triangle is a good model to look at here. So this is an illustration of how to narrow down the broad to the narrow. For example, you see in the top of the triangle that's inverted, the word pollution. Well, you can't study pollution, that's way too broad. Some students want to study that, that's fine. You want to narrow it down, maybe it's air pollution. So there's different kinds of pollution. Air pollution, water pollution, so you're narrowing down pollution to air pollution. Well, that's still a broad topic. What about the causes of air pollution? That's even narrower still. You're still talking about pollution, you're talking about air pollution, but maybe you want to look at the causes of air pollution. This is where a lot of dissertation students think, okay, I'm going to look at the causes of air pollution. Still too big, way too broad. Let's look at maybe the effects of aerosol products on air pollution. Now we're getting more specific. Of all the different causes of air pollution, let's explore the effects of aerosol products on air pollution. So narrow down your topic. Another example here. Let's take distance learning. That's still too broad. Well, let's look at the lack of students in distance learning. It's still distance learning, but let's look at a specific aspect. Still too broad, the lack of students. So let's cement down a little further to study why students don't attend distance education classes at a community college. That's even narrower still. But still too broad overall. Narrow it down some more. Does the use of website technology in the classroom deter students from enrolling in a distance education class? So the whole idea behind this research triangle illustration is to get your thinking from the broad to the narrow. And your dissertation is the narrow. Just some other thoughts in terms of how do you formulate these ideas. Well, I have this chart that you'll see on your slide about how to formulate your ideas. Well, you start with this great subject area. Maybe it's business, maybe it's education, nonprofit, higher ed, organizational leadership. That's broad, that's great. But narrow it down to a specific issue or problem. What's the concern? What's the problem that needs a solution within that discipline? Now, still too broad, let's narrow it down to the evidence for the issue. Is there evidence in the literature that speaks to the problem in your discipline? Then you're going to look at the deficiencies in the evidence. So maybe someone hasn't researched this, or someone found that the solution works but didn't try this other solution to the problem within your discipline. And therefore, after all that, you come down to narrowing it down to the question, what remedying the deficiencies will do for the select audiences. What's it going to do? How's it going to help that specific context in that discipline in the field? Okay? The problem statement. Because purpose and problems are so tied together, you want to look at the problem statement. So remember that the problem statement represents a clear problem in your field as evidenced by the literature. It is clear, it is succinct. Sometimes problem statements are too big. I've seen this. I want to do a study that saves the world. Don't do that right now. You can do that later on, but get your doctorate first. Sometimes the problem statements are too small. So the study will explore the lived experiences of 5 students in a classroom. Well, that's way too narrow. Too narrow. It should be unique, meaningful, and not your opinion. Again, everything is based on the literature. So it's not a problem if you say it's a problem. It's a problem if the literature, the themes in the literature, say it is. Here's an example. I won't read it verbatim, but you can take a look at it. What do you think of this problem statement? Is it too big? Is it too broad? There's a lot of information on there. It's not known how the use of a smartphone application affects the technology accessibility barrier, the language barrier, and parental involvement within the Title I elementary school. Stop right there. Way too broad. This problem statement focuses on too many elements of the smartphone application. Language, parental involvement, those are great things to study, but it's still too broad. Here's another one. Food waste in the United States has increased 50% since 1974. The problem is that there's little public acknowledgement of this. How do you define what public acknowledgement is? It is a problem, but that's way too broad. Again, looking at the problem and starting to narrow it down. Here's some tips to a good problem statement. Once you come up with a good problem statement, you need to address the following considerations. These are good questions to ask when you formulate it. The field and the scope where the problem exists. Are you talking about this area of the discipline or this area of the discipline? Leadership, that's really broad. Leadership in business, leadership in education, leadership in organizations, in nonprofit, in government. The background of the problem. What's the context behind why the problem exists in the first place? Think about that. What about the deficiencies in the literature? As you've been perusing through the research literature, what do you find? Maybe there is a strain of literature because that's the in topic right now, but there's still deficiencies in the evidence that address this problem. Consider that. Another thing in writing a good problem statement is who will be impacted by it. Certainly the whole world is impacted by any problem statement, but what is it specifically? What target audience specifically is impacted? And then we want to take a look at the specific leadership or business issue that's addressed. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just a philosophical understanding. It's not a good one. Maybe it's a specific issue in leadership or business. That's better. The problems lead us to the purpose statement. So just to review the purpose statement asks why you're doing the study. Many times I find students trying to formulate a purpose statement, and the best advice I give them is just write these words down. The purpose of this study is to blank. Maybe it's to identify, explore, to understand. Those are qualitative type studies. Maybe it's to identify relationships, associations, predictions. Those are correlational studies. Maybe the purpose of the study is to establish a cause and effect. It's an experimental study. Maybe the purpose of the study is to assess an impact or level of effectiveness. That's an evaluation study. Those are types of studies. Importantly, how will this study that you're going to do address the problem that you've defined? What's it going to do? So it's the question that says, that's great that you have a problem. So what? What are you going to do about it? Good question to ask. The more tips on the purpose statement is, what's the focus of interest? What are you really looking at? Why is this interesting in the first place? I mean, it's great to talk about certain nuances of leadership or business, but why is this interesting? What are we going to learn as a result of what the problem will solve? So when you solve the problem, what are you going to learn? Are you just going to gain more knowledge about the problem? I would say that's not good enough of a problem. It's great to learn new knowledge, but you have to learn about the solution to the problem. That's what we're focused on here. Why is this even worth knowing in the first place? It's another good question. How will we know that your results will be of value to the field? It's the so what question. Remember that the purpose statement should be clear, it should be focused, it should be concise, and it should be researchable. Is it understandable in plain English? Academic writing, but can anyone understand it? Is it focused? Is it narrow enough? Is it that narrowing down the research triangle? Is it concise? I did the session on cutting words out. Do you have all these unnecessary words in your problem statement? And is it researchable? Is it within the scope of you to finish your dissertation? I've known many dissertation students who say, I want to do this, and then they start gathering some information. Oh, wow, this leads me to some great literature, and all of a sudden they're completely off topic, and they never finish. So find the problem, define it, and finish it. That's what's key here. The purpose statement is built upon the foundation of the problem statement. So the problem is blank. Doing this research will blank. Will solve the problem. How will it solve the problem? Great, little formula to remember there. So the key is to figure out the problem first. If you got a good problem, hopefully you'll have a good purpose. Here's a good example here, how you connect the problem with the purpose. The problem is that 8th grade students in the Seattle School District are performing below the statewide standard on the math portion of the standardized state exam, as evidenced by, and so on and so forth. The purpose of this qualitative study, or the purpose of the study, is to assess the effectiveness of an alternative process to teach math to 8th graders in Tacoma. Sorry, so it should be to Seattle, and determine whether it is associated with increased performance on statewide standardized exams. So it's not what you just learn about the problem. It's not just finding out that 8th grade students are performing below the statewide standard. That's great, and we know why, and okay, we can do a lot more research on why, but the key is, what do you learn from if you intervene or you solve the problem? That's what matters. Now, in research questions, there's basically 2 types of research. 3 if you want here, but 2 major themes. There's the quantitative, which deals with hypotheses and variables. There's the qualitative, so that determines the qualities of a case, a relationship. What are the qualities that are going to be discovered? A lot more words in qualitative, a lot more numbers in quantitative. Then there's mixed methods, mixed method study. A mixed method study includes both types, some quantitative, some qualitative, and then a synthesis. We highly encourage you to consider not doing a mixed method study. Don't do it. One of the reasons why is that it takes a lot more time, and you have to be skillful in both the quantitative and qualitative studies, the methodology, and then you have to synthesize the 2 together. So there's a lot more work in mixed method studies. Again, we won't say no, but we highly encourage you to not do it. All this leads to the research question. Remember, topic, problem, purpose, and now the specific research question you're going to ask. Looking at the research questions, remember, what are they for? Well, why do we have research questions in the first place? Well, what questions will your study ask that relate to your problem? What will your research answer? The number one problem with research questions is this. There's no way to answer them. It's too subjective. It's too broad. You want to study the research about this, but there's no as evidenced by. It's too subjective. So the key is to be clear, objective, and point out how the questions will be answered. The research question helps guide the data collection process. They're linked to the problem statement, which is a whole thing of alignment that we keep on reminding you. And in qualitative studies, these are not the same as the interview questions. So when you're doing a qualitative study, the research question is not the same as the interview question. The interview questions stem from the research questions, but they're not the same. Typically, this is just for example, in a qualitative study, you'll have 2, maybe 3, maybe 4, 2 or 3 research questions, but you may have 10 to 15 interview questions that are linked to the research questions. So here's an example. Why did the leader cross the road? That's a fair research question, but it's too broad. Here's the same kind of question that's a little too narrow. How many leaders crossed the road on July 20th, 2016? A little too narrow, but again, we're looking at broad versus narrow. So here's the best way to look at that. What were some of the environmental factors that occurred in Seattle, Washington in July 2016 that contributed to leaders crossing Denny Way? It's a lot better research question. I don't know what the problem is, but in any case, that's a good research question. It ties in, it's not broad, it's not too narrow. Here's another example of research questions that we've seen. Will leadership training make employees more successful? Similar question, will professional development make teachers more effective? Those are good questions, but they're not specific enough. I'd like you to maybe spend some time to think about that before you go to the next slide. Maybe discuss it if you want. I'll pause for a little bit. All right, so hopefully you have thought about what you think of those 2 research questions. They're not bad, but here's a tip. What if you did this? What if you added just this phrase at the end of those 2 questions, either of those questions? As evidenced by. This changes that first question to, will leadership training make employees more successful at leading their teams as evidenced by the results from 360-degree review of employees using the XYZ tool? A lot better research question. Here's the second one. Will professional development help teachers lead their classes to improve scores on the ABC standardized exams? A lot better. Now, with research questions, you want to avoid subjectivity. The key is to have that word, phrase, or even the concept of as evidenced by. You want to answer the question in definitive terms. Either it is or it's not. There's no subjectivity. Maybe it could, maybe the effect is this, maybe it's this. No, it's either it is or it isn't. You want to craft clear questions that have objective measures. As evidenced by is such a key phrase. It's a good tip to think about. Just because your study did not reveal what you thought it might does not mean it's a failed study. You can do your research, you can do your dissertation, and the data show that it didn't turn out to be what you thought. That's okay. That's not a failed study. You gain more research, knowledge, but you figured out how that knowledge would apply in the field. Did it solve the problem? No, it didn't solve the problem. That's okay. It's okay. If you didn't solve the problem, well, maybe another research study will look at it and trying to help solve the problem. So just because the data didn't come out the way it did doesn't necessarily mean you failed in the study. The key is to set up the good question and let the machine sort of run itself. Okay, so here's a quick summary of what we've talked about. Problem statements. Remember, they should be clear, concise, limited in scope. Don't try to solve a problem for the whole world. You'll have time to do that, but get your doctorate first. Purpose statements. Why are you investigating this problem, and what intervention do you propose to address your problem? Finally, the research questions. What questions do you intend to ask and answer with this research? Problem statement, purpose statement, research question. They're all aligned. That's the key. Here's some words of wisdom. Rather than thinking of your research as the whole forest, think of it as a seed in the forest. It is small, but it will grow to reach out to other parts of the forest in time. The same can be said of your research. It can be small, limited in scope, and impacting a small sample or population. If well constructed, it will grow, expand, and generalize to a much larger population. Worry not about a forest, but plant a seed. Better, that is. Hope you've enjoyed this. I hope this has given you some practical tips. I look forward to seeing you in person really soon. Thanks for listening.